By definition, military production output is not real wealth. Wars destroy wealth rather than creating it. There are a number of myths about the Great Depression which are very popular. The first is that Herbert Hoover was a do-nothing laissez-faire president who simply allowed unemployment to rise and was responsible for a total economic collapse. In fact, this is the opposite of the truth. Hoover was an extremely interventionist president, and one of the main reasons why the Great Depression became so severe was because of the active and interventionist policy he followed, in particular his refusal to allow asset values and wages to find a natural clearing level. The second myth is that the New Deal saved American capitalism and brought the Great Depression to an end. The historians generally do not believe this anymore. The fact is that in most parts of the world, the Great Depression began to end much, much earlier and much more quickly than it did in the United States. In Great Britain, the Great Depression was over by 1933, and Britain in fact enjoyed very rapid economic growth from 1931 onwards. In the United States, by contrast, not only does the Great Depression go on for more than a decade, it in fact actually gets worse, and by 1937 the level of unemployment in the United States is as high as it had been in 1932, but in addition the federal government has built up an enormous debt. The third common myth is that what eventually ended the Depression and saved the economy was World War II. By definition, military production output is not real wealth. Wars destroy wealth rather than creating it. In fact, if you look at the figures for American economic activity and you strip out the war effects, as people like Robert Higgs have shown, what you can only conclude is that in fact the Great Depression does not really end until 1947 or 1948, and that the war simply conceals or covers up the continuing low level of real wealth creating economic activity in the United States.
Hurricane hits your town and the power is out. Your child is diabetic and you need power to keep her insulin refrigerated. You're desperate. But perhaps you're in luck. I have an electrical generator that I'm willing to sell you, and you have the $800 that generators like mine typically cost. The only problem is, I don't want to sell it to you for $800. I want $1,300. Now, as it turns out, my offer would be illegal in a majority of U.S. states, about 34 of which have statutes that prohibit price gouging, a practice that's usually defined as raising prices on certain kinds of goods to an unfair or excessively high level during an emergency. So there's really no question about what the law would do to me if I made an offer like this to you. But even if the law is clear, the moral status of price gouging is not. Is price gouging always immoral? And whether it is or not, should it be illegal? Let's look at the question of morality first. Is asking $1,300 for the generator morally wrong? Of course, you'd rather buy it from me for $800, but there are 3 reasons why my charging a higher price isn't obviously wrong. First, remember, you don't have to buy it from me for $1,300. If that's more than you think the generator is worth, you're free to walk on by. If you do decide to pay, it's because you believe you're getting more value out of the generator than you do from the $1,300 you gave up for it. In other words, you're coming away from the deal with more than you gave up. Second, ask yourself what would happen if I did charge only $800 for the generator. Remember, you aren't the only person who needs electric power in this situation. If the price was lower, would the generator still have been there when you tried to buy it? Or would someone else have snatched it up before you ever had a chance? This leads directly to the third point, which is that high prices do more than just line sellers' pockets. They also affect how buyers and sellers behave. For buyers, high prices reduce demand and encourage conservation. They lead buyers to ask themselves whether they really need that generator or hotel room, or whether they can do without. And by doing so, they allow at least some of those resources to be conserved for other people who might need them more, and therefore are willing to pay more. And for sellers, high prices encourage people to bring more goods to where they're needed. If generators can be bought in an area not affected by the hurricane for $800 and resold later for $1,300, that creates a profit incentive for people to bring generators from where they're less needed to where they're more needed, to get them to where they'll do more good for people who need them most. All of this leads to a surprising conclusion. Even someone who can't afford to pay $1,300 for a generator benefits from a system in which sellers are allowed to charge that price. That's because the profit motive that that system creates encourages competition, which increases supply, and ultimately drives down prices to a more affordable level for everyone. Now, it's true that when price gouging is legal, some people won't be able to afford the higher prices that result. But ask yourself, what alternative institutions would do better? When price gouging is prohibited, goods usually go to whoever shows up first. If you care about distributive justice, is that really a better system? I think there are good reasons to doubt that price gouging is immoral. But suppose you're not convinced. Suppose you think price gouging is exploitative and wrong. Should it be illegal? The answer, even if we assume that price gouging is immoral, is almost certainly that it should not be illegal. If price gouging is wrong, it's because it hurts people in vulnerable situations. But then the last thing you want to do is hurt those vulnerable people even more. Remember, the only reason price gouging occurs is because a disaster causes demand for certain goods to go up or supply to go down, with the result that there isn't enough stuff to go around. Anti-gouging laws don't do anything to address this underlying shortage. In fact, they make it worse by destroying incentives for conservation and increased supply. So even if you think that price gouging is morally wrong and that merchants should refuse to engage in it, making it illegal doesn't make sense. It hurts the very people who need our help most.
What's better, knowing the price of something or knowing with perfect information how much something should cost? It's a trick question. Suppose there are two farmers, Al Truis and Mo Cash for Me. Each of them has 500 acres of land that could grow either corn or soybeans. Suppose I ask what their plans are. Both of them text back, I don't know. Now suppose we've borrowed a crystal ball from some genie and we know everything. Among the things the crystal ball can tell us are that Brazil has had a terrible summer with drought and then late floods that wiped out 40% of their soybean crop. It also tells us that new uses for soybean curd have pushed up consumer demand for soy paste all over Asia. Meanwhile, corn crop yields have hit record highs all over the world, and at the same time, several countries ended their corn-based ethanol programs, leading to an extraordinary corn surplus. Our first farmer, Al, has to decide what to plant. Al never wanted anything for himself. All he cares about was doing what was best for all of humanity. He does research, trying to decide which crop will be better for humanity as a whole. But it's hard for Al to determine what information is most relevant because he doesn't trust price information, and the knowledge that he needs is too dispersed, too specific, and too hard to learn. Now, Al knows a lot, but still not enough. He's stuck at I don't know. So he makes a guess, plants corn. Al's put a tremendous amount of time and resources into his research instead of focusing on what he's good at, running a farm. As a result, he doesn't get much corn planted, has a hard time selling the corn he does produce. He has to sell for very little, and he ends up bankrupt. Let's look at Mo's experience. Since he cares only about profits, he focuses on prices. In early February, the price of corn futures falls sharply. But soy futures indicate that prices for soy delivered in August should be excellent. Why did this happen? Mo has no idea, and he couldn't possibly care less. Mo sells a large soy futures contract to lock in the high price and plant soy on every square inch of land that he owns. It's a selfish bet, one that'll make Mo a lot of money. Instead of trying to be an expert in all the disparate subjects he'd need to master to have perfect information about the marketplace, he just focused time and resources on running his farm. And the only other information he used was prices. So he produced a lot of soybeans and did well for himself. Which of the two did the right thing, the better thing for society? What would the genie with the crystal ball have told us? The genie would have looked at the glut of corn and the shortage of soy that made it so valuable and told us what people need is more soy. But of course, there's no such thing as genies in the real world. Information is too dispersed, too complicated to solve the IDK problem through research. There's just too much to know. Fortunately, farmers don't need a crystal ball because prices do exactly what we were hoping that the genie would do. Farmers don't need to know why a price is high or low. And in fact, no single person could possibly explain it fully. But by growing the crop that produces the greater profit, farmers can produce the crop that solves the shortage, meets the demand, and satisfies the requirements of innovation. It's impossible to attain perfect information about the entire marketplace, which is changing all the time. Prices are a way of condensing all that information into one easily understood signal, almost like magic.
Karl Marx famously thought that a capitalist economy promotes the systematic exploitation of workers. For Marx, this idea was based on a labor theory of value, which most scholars today reject. Nevertheless, many still agree with Marx's basic claim that capitalism is inherently exploitative. They simply define exploitation in broader and less contentious terms. Instead of thinking about exploitation as involving the forced extraction of surplus value from labor, contemporary philosophers define it as taking unfair advantage of others' vulnerability. And defined in this way, many philosophers think that contemporary capitalism is rife with exploitation, with economically powerful capitalists taking unfair advantage of workers' vulnerability in order to maximize their profit. So, what should we make of this argument? Is capitalism exploitative? And what's the alternative? Well, first, it's absolutely correct that many capitalists want to exploit workers. They want to pay as low a wage as possible and get as much work out of workers as possible in order to maximize profit. But the fact that other capitalists also want to exploit workers in this way makes it difficult for any of them to do so. This is because competitive pressure forces capitalists to pay workers close to the value of what those workers produce, whether they want to or not. If you try to pay someone less than they're worth, someone else will offer them more because they can profit by doing so. Imagine you're in an auction, bidding against others for $1. Of course, you'd like to pay as little as possible for that $1. But if someone else was bidding 60 cents for it, wouldn't it be worth your while to bid 62? And wouldn't someone else then bid 64 and so on? In a competitive marketplace, that same process leads capitalists to pay workers close to the value of what they produce, not because they want to, but because they have to. The second point to keep in mind about capitalism and exploitation is this. Even when exploitative or unfair exchanges do take place, the institutions of a free market ensure that they will at least usually be mutually beneficial, because the exchanges are voluntary. As an example, think about an exchange that a lot of people find unfair: payday loans. A poor working man needs money right now to meet his basic needs, and so gets a loan from a payday loan store, but only by paying fees equivalent to a 400% annual percentage rate. Let's grant, at least for the sake of argument, that charging such a high interest rate is unfair. Even so, it's important to bear in mind that both parties had the opportunity to say no to the exchange if they believed that they could do better somewhere else. And because of this fact, because the exchange was voluntary in just this very weak sense, this means that both parties expect to gain more from the exchange than they give up. It means that unless one of them has made a mistake, the exchange will be mutually beneficial. This is an important fact. Important for the well-being of individual laborers, and important for the growth and development of society as a whole. Mutually beneficial exchanges are how wealth is created in society. And the more wealth a society creates over time, the less vulnerability there is for capitalists to exploit. Markets aren't perfect. But whether or not you think capitalism is exploitative, you need to ask, what's the alternative? The usual suggestion is political regulation and control. But if our concern is to minimize exploitation, we need to ask whether this alternative really makes sense. After all, citizens are in a position of tremendous vulnerability relative to the state, and lobbyists, bureaucrats, and elected officials will often be tempted to exploit that vulnerability for their own private gain. Think of the way in which our political institutions subsidize large agribusinesses, bail out auto companies, cartelize the banking industry through the Federal Reserve System, and so on. All of these policies benefit the interests of the economically powerful and politically well-connected at the expense of ordinary citizens. That's not a free market at work. That's big government. And politics is unlike markets in that political exchanges aren't voluntary. When the government wants to use your money to bail out GM, you don't have the right to say no. And this means there's no guarantee that the exchange will be mutually beneficial. When politics is involved, one party's gain usually comes at someone else's expense. Politicians gain from the contributions they receive from big business, and big business gains from the favors they receive from government. Sure, those favors have a cost, but because government has the power of coercion, it can force third parties to pay that cost. Those who can afford political influence get the benefits, and those who cannot afford it suffer the consequences. This is how politics works. And it's not because we have bad people in office and need to get nicer people in. It's because of the structural nature of politics. Because the state has the power to impose its decisions by force on the public. Just hoping that the state will use its power on behalf of the vulnerable isn't enough. We need to ask ourselves, if we really want to reduce the amount of exploitation in the world, is increasing the power of the state really the best way to do it?
If we look at the history of the world, a huge fraction of the improvements in standard of living have come because private businesses have created new products, have given people jobs, have generated profits that raise people out of poverty and allow them to live fruitful and productive lives with reasonable standards of living. We can have much more of that, and it will have beneficial effects around the world if we step back from the excessive regulation and have a much more capitalistic system. My name is Jeff Myron, and I'm Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Department of Economics at Harvard University. I want to talk about 3 myths about capitalism. The first is that being pro-capitalism is the same as being pro-business. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The point of capitalism is to make sure that businesses have to compete vigorously against each other, and that benefits consumers. It's not good for the businesses per se, because they have to work really hard. So many businesses understand this, and they hate capitalism. They're constantly trying to get government to erect various rules, restrictions, regulations that help them, but that are not in the interest of the consumers. So pro-capitalism is good for consumers. That's whom we're ultimately trying to help. A second myth is that capitalism generates an unfair distribution of income. What true capitalism does is rewards people who are productive, people who work a lot of hours, people who have a lot of talent, people who come up with good ideas. They get big rewards under capitalism, and people who don't do those sorts of things get less. The one negative one might be concerned about is that some people have very little skill. They are not able to earn very much left on their own, and so very reasonable people support some anti-poverty spending. But that's completely different than interfering with capitalism, regulating prices, limiting quantities, imposing all sorts of things on businesses. Those make the economy less productive, give us a smaller pie, and make it even harder for us to operate programs that help those who are less fortunate and because they were unlucky. The third myth is that capitalism was responsible for the recent financial crisis and the recession. That again is almost exactly the opposite of what is true. First of all, nobody who's being intellectually honest thinks that we had unbridled serious capitalism before the crisis hit, before the subprime buildup occurred, before we had all of the housing problems. We had enormous government interventions that subsidized risk, enormous government interventions that encouraged an overinvestment housing. If one's going to try to draw any conclusions, it seems to suggest much more clearly that interfering with capitalism generates financial crises, generates recessions, because what we experienced was directly related to the incentives for excessive risk-taking, the incentives for overinvestment in housing that were created by government. The private sector responded to those incentives, so of course the private sector can't be completely absolved of being involved, but in the sense of causing, it was the bad policies that caused it, not what the private sector or capitalism did on its own. Most importantly, whenever government bail out people who took excessive risk, they encourage people to do more of that in the future. And we unfortunately went a huge way in that direction via the TARP and via all the Federal Reserve policies, which helped Wall Street and the risk takers not have to pay the true price for all the excessive risk taking they engaged in.
The most important thing to understand about the modern world, actually, is that once people were very poor and now they're very rich. In 1800, the average person in the world made $3 a day. I mean, the modern equivalent of $3 a day. So the goods and services, the stuff you could buy in the amount of $3 a day. So 3/4 of a cappuccino per day, nothing else. In the last 30 years, the percentage of people who are that badly off in the world has fallen by half. It's been halved. So things are going very well. And for we in places like the United States, where they've gone exceptionally well since 1800, we're making, now hear this, $130 a day. And what a transformation. It's just incredible. Now, we had earned the $3 a day forever. So there was in history, if you want a short economic history, since the beginning of time, it was $3 a day going along like this. And then right here, which is 1800, it goes up like mad. And there's this fantastic transformation of the condition of ordinary folks. Why did it happen? One old explanation is exploitation. You hear this a lot. We are rich because there are a bunch of poor people elsewhere in the world who are poor. That's not true. There's always been exploitation in history, and it didn't cause economic growth. So it can't be modern exploitation. Nor can it be, to think of a more conservative way of looking at it, investment. It's not investment. It's not piling bricks on bricks or BAs on BAs. It's new ideas. It's innovation. The fantastic number of changes in machinery and materials and organizational ideas, such as the modern university or reinforced concrete. It's just amazing. That caused this hockey stick, the blade of the hockey stick. Why did this happen? Two changes in Holland and England in the 1600s and 1700s, which was a rise of economic liberty and social honor for inventors, merchants, manufacturers. Before, these were dishonored occupations, then they became honored. And out of that came a tremendous burst of innovation that had been earlier discouraged because they weren't free and they weren't honored.
When is a potato chip not a potato chip? When it's an externality. An externality is when a transaction between two people, call them Art and Betty, has an effect on a third person, Carl, without Carl's permission. Suppose Art sells Betty some potato chips. Now Betty really likes potato chips. She opens the bag, she's looking forward to eating the chips. As she eats them, she makes yum, yum, yum sounds. Just look at her, she loves it. But no matter how loud she is, there is no externality unless someone, like Carl, is there to hear her. Obviously, Art benefits from selling the product, and Betty benefits from buying the product, since this exchange was voluntary. But Carl's affected by a negative externality. He's harmed. He didn't get anything, but he has to listen to all that crunching, yum-yumming. It really annoys him. So it takes three to have an externality: a seller, a buyer, and at least one additional person who is not voluntarily a participant in the transaction. In a previous video, I claimed that prices can tell people the right thing to do. But if there are externalities, do prices tell us everything we need to know? The answer must be no, because with externalities, the price of something and its actual cost are different. The price is the amount Betty paid to Art, but the cost is the amount Betty paid to Art plus the cost to Carl of having Betty crunch potato chips in his ear during class. The problem of externalities is that prices do not capture all of the costs of the transaction. Instead, some of the costs are borne by people who never gave their permission. It seems like the solution would be to try to adjust price so that it coincides with the total cost. For many people, that means fix it with taxes. In other words, impose a tax equal to the difference between the market price and the true cost, to force the buyer and the seller to bear the full cost of their transaction. This is what economists call internalizing the cost. We may not need to resort to government action, of course. One way we solve externality problems is called manners. If Carl tells Betty her crunching is bothering him, she'll probably apologize and stop. Then there's bargaining, a solution proposed by R.H. Coase. If Carl complains, Betty might make a side payment, sharing her chips with Carl. Once Carl's crunching too, there are no externalities, only chips. Even if these solutions don't work, it may not be easy to fix it with taxes through state action. Remember, the problem is information. Prices don't contain the full information about cost. But where can accurate information be obtained? How can the state be expected to acquire more accurate information and then act on it effectively? The most interesting answer to these questions came from the original scholar to propose fixing it with taxes, A.C. Pigou. Pigou was a really smart guy and understood that guessing at the correct tax would be very difficult. Back in 1920, Pigou said, "It is not sufficient to contrast the imperfect adjustments of unfettered enterprise with the best adjustment that economists in their studies can imagine. For we cannot expect that any state authority will attain, or even wholeheartedly seek, that ideal. Such authorities are liable alike to ignorance, to sectional pressure, and to personal corruption by private interest, a loud-voiced part of their constituents, if organized for votes, may easily outweigh the whole." The fix-it-with-taxes solution often has unintended bad consequences. The government has a knowledge problem, just like everybody else. Every economics student learns about externalities and Pigovian taxes, but professors rarely mention how hard Pigou himself thought it would be to get those taxes exactly right.
The tragedy of the commons is a concern among biologists and social scientists alike. I'd rather refer to this as the problem of open access resources. In short, the tragedy of the commons occurs because each user receives direct benefit of using the resource, but only bears a fraction of the cost of its exploitation. So examples abound. I mean, it could be African elephants that are near extinction. It could be Amazon rainforest deforestation. It could be overfishing of many of the fisheries worldwide. It could be overfishing in the pond, say, right here. The idea behind this has been around for many years, but Garrett Hardin in his 1968 piece in Science was the first to bring this to the forefront about the time that the environmental movement began planning its first Earth Day. In Garrett Hardin's example, he presents us with an open access pasture. Anyone who wants to can bring their cattle to graze. Each rancher's goal is to maximize his or her private benefit. Every rancher has the incentive to bring more and more cattle to the pasture because they receive the direct benefit of grazing their cattle there. Unfortunately, they only bear a fraction of the cost of the overexploited pasture, so they're going to continue to add cow after cow until the pasture is overgrazed and destroyed and no longer usable as pastureland. In other words, their individual incentive invites overall ruin. For even though if they recognize that the pasture is being exploited, somebody else will bring a cow if they don't. And so they'll continue to do so. It's not that they don't know the asset's being exploited, it's that if they wait and try to delay, it'll just be exploited by somebody else. The large issue here is there's a lack of excludability. The ranchers have no way of stopping others from adding cattle to the pasture. In his piece, Garrett Hardin suggested two main ways to go about solving the tragedy of the commons. The first is through privatization or private ownership. The second is through public ownership or government ownership. So whenever we have public ownership, one of the benefits is that we still all share the collective rights to this asset. This is one of the reasons why we have the national park system, to protect natural open space at Yosemite and the beauty of Yellowstone and things of that nature. But one of the problems with public ownership is that the decision makers don't bear the cost of their actions, nor do they receive additional value from any good decisions they make. For instance, imagine if you're a park ranger and you find some innovative way to reduce large forest fires that adds value to the park itself. You don't receive the direct benefit of your decisions. You and your staff are not going to receive large pay raises or are not going to receive the large stream of value that comes from that decision. However, private ownership does solve this problem. With private ownerships, the decision maker bears the direct cost of their actions. And so for any poor decision, they're going to bear the costs of. But any positive, innovative decision, they'll receive the benefits. So if you were a ranger or a park owner who'd found this innovative way to solve the problem with forest fires, then you would receive the stream of value from that good decision. There's not a silver bullet to the problem of open access resources. There's not a one-size-fits-all strategy. But we do know that limiting access and ensuring that decision makers bear the costs of their actions allows us to address key concerns with open access resource problems.
It's a Saturday night and you're at a house party. Suddenly the police show up and they start arresting people for underage drinking and other violations. The next thing you know, you're in cuffs and the police will search your pockets. They take out your cell phone and start to look at your recent text messages for evidence. What should you do? Tell them they need a warrant. A recent Supreme Court case just affirmed this. The police do not have the right to search your cell phone when you get arrested. That includes your texts, phone calls, photos, Uber receipts, anything, without a warrant or your consent. In the case of Riley versus California, following a traffic violation, the police arrested a guy and searched his cell phone. By looking at pictures on his phone, they were able to link him to a shooting. On appeal, the Supreme Court unanimously found that the search was unconstitutional. All 9 justices agreed. If you want to search a phone, get a warrant. Cell phones aren't the same as other personal property that police are allowed to search, and can't be treated like that because they contain far more personal data. Searching your phone is an invasion of privacy as serious as searching your home. The police need a warrant to justify that action. So if you find yourself in a tough spot and the police are asking to search your phone, remain calm and polite, but tell them you do not consent. Remember, you have the right to remain silent. And always ask for a lawyer. You might be wondering what all of this means for your computers, tablets, cameras, or other devices. While the Riley v. California ruling isn't specific, the Supreme Court implied that these same restrictions may apply. And remember, police can still search your pockets and items such as your bag and packs of cigarettes. I'm Josh Blackman, constitutional law professor at the South Texas College of Law in Houston. Tune in for a live 1-hour discussion with me to learn more about your constitutional rights and other privacy concerns. Remember, privacy is a constitutional right until you give it up.
Another contemporary economic myth is that women make 75 cents for every dollar men make because they're discriminated against in labor markets. Like other myths, this does have a kernel of truth to it. So for example, if you add up all the incomes of women and divide by the number of women in the labor force, and then do the same thing for men, what you'll find is on average, women do make about 75% of what men do. What's happening here is not discrimination in the labor market, but differences in the choices that men and women make about investing in their knowledge, their education, their skills, and their job experience that lead to them getting paid different salaries. Economists talk about people's human capital. And by human capital, we mean the knowledge, the skills, the education, and the job experience that people have. And economics argues that people get paid wages according to that human capital. It turns out that men and women invest very differently in their human capital. And we can see that in 4 different ways. First of all, educational choices. Men, for example, tend to go into fields like engineering. Women tend to go into social sciences, into psychology, into nursing. And so where men are making higher salaries as engineers or perhaps in the business world, women tend to end up in jobs for which their salaries are somewhat lower. So even though they may have the same years of schooling, the different choices they've made about their majors lead to them working in different areas and getting paid differently. Secondly, men and women have different expectations about work. For example, if women expect down the road to take time off to raise children, they'll make different choices today about what kinds of skills they acquire than if they imagine they'll be working full-time for the rest of their lives. And we know historically that many women in the 1960s and 70s didn't imagine that they would be working full-time at age 40 and ended up making choices that led them to have jobs when they were working at age 40 that didn't pay as well as they might have otherwise. Younger women today, of course, are more likely to imagine themselves working at age 40 and therefore make different investments today. Another difference between men and women is full versus part-time work. Women are much more likely than men to work part-time, men are more likely to work full-time. And part-time work, even for the same kinds of jobs, tends to pay less than full-time work. And women tend to prefer part-time work more than men because women still tend to take on the majority of the responsibility for children in the home. Finally, men and women differ in terms of their tenure on a job or the way in which their careers get interrupted. If it's the case that women take time off from the workforce to raise children, that will have an impact on their salaries down the road. So when we put these 4 things together, what we get is that the difference between men and women's pay is not a result of labor market discrimination, but of the choices that men and women make before they enter the labor market or even when they're in the labor market about the kinds of jobs they want to have and the way they want to balance family and work. Studies that have tried to control for all these factors have shown that if you take a man and a woman, same experience, same education, same job, and compare their salaries, what you find is that women make about 98% of what men do. So that gender wage gap pretty much disappears. And in some jobs, women actually make more. Now, it might well be the case that women are being discriminated against or that sexism is a problem in the choices that women make. For example, girls are guided away from math classes and guided into other kinds of classes. It's also certainly the case that our expectations about women's roles versus caring for children in the household and men's roles about caring for children in the household are very different. And if we think those are poor choices, if we want to see women's pay more equal to men, what we need to do is convince more women to go into areas such as the sciences and mathematics and engineering, and we need to convince men to take more responsibility for children in the house. When those begin to even out, we'll see wages begin to even out as well. But in the meantime, whatever choices men and women make, the wages they're paid in the market will reflect the productivity associated with those choices and are not the result of discrimination.
There's a movement in cities across the country to raise the minimum wage to $15 per hour. One of the most prominent advocates is former Labor Secretary Robert Reich, who thinks that $15 per hour should be the minimum wage for the entire country. This is a bad idea. Here are 3 reasons why. First of all, it would kill jobs. One of the basic lessons of economics is that when the price of something goes up, people buy less of it. So, if the price of pumpkin lattes rises, you can expect consumers to buy fewer of them. This law of demand also affects the market for low-skilled workers. Raising the minimum wage means a higher cost of employing each worker, which makes workers less affordable than before. Our coffee shop won't keep a worker at the mandated $15 per hour if that worker's efforts only result in $7.25 per hour in added revenue. Over the course of a year, a shop that keeps such a worker full-time would lose $15,500. So instead, it will eliminate that job. And evidence shows employers in fact do respond in this way to minimum wage hikes. Recent research by economists Jeffrey Clemens and Michael Wither finds that 1.4 million jobs were destroyed in the late 2000s when the minimum wage rose across all 50 states by an average of nearly 30%. And worse, those job losses were probably suffered by the people who need jobs the most. This fact brings us to reason number 2. the minimum wage actually hurts the people we most want to help. When the minimum wage rises, the workers fired first and the ones hired last are those who employers judge to be the least productive. The inner city teen from the lousy school district or the immigrant with poor English will be fired before the suburban American teen from the excellent school district. So those who are most disadvantaged tend to suffer the most job losses. This reality is compounded by the fact that raising the minimum wage causes more competition for jobs. A supermarket job that once paid $8 per hour draws more applicants when it pays $15 per hour. Applicants who include retirees and people with higher education who re-enter the workforce only because of the higher wage. Because these people often have more skills, they squeeze out immigrants and those from disadvantaged backgrounds who are likely more desperate for the jobs and certainly more desperate to gain job experience. The third reason is that minimum wage hikes aren't necessary to give deserving workers raises. 96% of American workers today earn wages higher than the current minimum wage, which proves that employers don't just pay the minimum that they're obliged to pay by law. Employers respond to the value that each employee adds so they can retain the best talent. It's expensive to train new employees, and businesses don't want to lose good workers to their competitors, so they raise worker pay voluntarily as employees gain more skills and experience. But when government imposes such raises by hiking the minimum wage, some of the least experienced workers will not only lose their current jobs, they'll find it incredibly hard to find other jobs. In essence, the minimum wage cuts off the first rung on the employment ladder, and it's that first, lowest paying rung that provides the skills and experience workers need to reach the next rung and to continue climbing their way to a better life.
To appreciate why market prices are essential to human well-being, consider what a fix we would be in without them. Suppose you are the commissar of railroads in the old Soviet Union. Markets and prices have been banished. You and your comrades, passionate communists all, now directly plan how to use available resources. You want a railroad from city A to city B, but between the cities is a mountain range. Suppose somehow you know that the railroad, once built, will serve the nation equally well whether it goes through the mountains or around. If you build through the mountains, you'll use much less steel for the tracks because that route is shorter, but you'll use a great deal of engineering to design the trestles and tunnels needed to cross the rough terrain. That matters because engineering is also needed to design irrigation systems, mines, harbor installations, and other structures, and you don't want to tie up engineering on your railroad if it would be more valuable designing those other structures instead. You can save engineering for other projects if you build around the mountains on level ground, but that way you'll use much more steel rail to go the longer distance, and steel is also needed for other purposes, for vehicles, girders, ships, pots and pans, and thousands of other things. Which route should you choose for the good of the nation? To answer, you would need to determine which bundle of resources is less urgently needed for other purposes. The large amount of engineering and small amount of steel for the route through the mountains, or the small amount of engineering and large amount of steel for the roundabout route. But how could you find out the urgency of need for engineering and steel in other uses? Just one way engineering is used is to build irrigation systems. To assess the importance of a particular irrigation system, you would need to know what the farmers know about how irrigation would increase the yield of their fields. And to know the value of that increased yield, you'd need to know what grocers know about their customers' eagerness for that produce. That in turn depends on what customers know about the better meals they could fix with that produce. How would you find all this out? Just one way to use steel is to build new trucks. To assess the importance of a particular new truck, you would need to know what the trucker knows about the capacity of his current truck, and how much more quickly he could make the deliveries his customers want with a new, bigger truck. To know the importance of those deliveries, you would need to know what his customers know about the value of getting goods delivered. That in turn depends on what still others know about the uses of those goods at their destinations. To reason about where to route the railroad, you need this kind of information for all possible uses of engineering and steel. That's a massive amount of knowledge, held by millions of people throughout society. How might you get it? You might try surveys, but think how many people you would need to survey. All those who prepare meals with produce, and all those who take delivery by truck for starters. The numbers would be staggering. And often people don't even know what they prefer until they face an actual choice. So they might not be able to answer survey questions accurately. Even if they could, by the time the surveys were returned and processed, much of the information would be out of date. And even if you could get complete and timely information about what everyone knows that's relevant to every use of steel and engineering, you would still need to deduce from it where to build the railroad. How would you begin to make sense of that mountain of data? In the words of Ludwig von Mises, you would be groping in the dark. You would face what is known as the knowledge problem of central planning, the reason why comprehensive socialism inevitably fails. Central planners cannot get the knowledge they need in order to plan effectively. You, Commissar, simply cannot know on what projects scarce resources should be used for the good of the nation. But now change the thought experiment. Imagine that, somewhere in the market economy part of the world, you are the chief operating officer of a railroad company. You work not for the good of the nation, but to generate profits for your firm. You want to run a railroad line from City C to City D. Again, there's a mountain range between them. Now how do you decide on the route? You choose what's cheapest. You would calculate the total cost of each route, for each one multiplying the amount of engineering required by the price of engineering, and adding that to the amount of steel required times the price of steel. Then you would choose whichever costs your company less. You might give no thought at all to the good of the nation, or society as a whole. But, and here's the marvel, by choosing the route that is cheapest for your company, you would thereby choose the route that's best for society. You would use the bundle of resources that's least urgently needed for other purposes. Why? Because those market prices you calculate with reflect the urgency of need for engineering and steel in all their alternative uses. For example, suppose customers wanting tastier meals would buy better, more expensive produce if it were on the shelf of their local grocery. In effect, they're offering grocers more for produce, so the grocers will offer farmers more for produce. So the farmers whose yields would be sufficiently improved by irrigation will offer more for irrigation systems, and those who build irrigation systems will offer engineers more to design them. Now that designing irrigation systems pays engineers better, people who want to hire engineers for other projects, such as railroads, will have to offer them at least as much to make it worth their while. The higher price tells everyone who uses engineering that it's become, for some reason, more valuable, so maybe they should use less. In this way, the market prices of resources represent the particular knowledge and preferences of millions of people who directly or indirectly use those resources, and the prices communicate that knowledge and those preferences to everyone interested. Only with market prices to communicate this vast amount of human knowledge to us can we calculate the least costly ways of producing the things we want, coordinate our activities with the activities of others, use resources where society values them most, and thereby satisfy as many human wants as possible. All of us want assurance that the things we buy are safe. What's the best way for us to get it? One way is to have a government agency assess products and allow or forbid their sale. This is the way it works for medicines. The Food and Drug Administration requires and oversees lengthy, expensive tests of each new drug. Based on those tests, it decides whether or not that drug may be used. A different approach is to allow competing private firms to assess the products and give each one a rating. Customers decide for themselves whether to buy or not based on these ratings. This is the way it works for thousands of products, from toasters and hair dryers to insulation and bulletproof vests. Manufacturers hire a private certification firm, such as Underwriters Laboratories, to evaluate their product's design and manufacturing process and to test it. If the product passes, the certifier's logo is added to it. Manufacturers pay for private certification because it increases sales. Customers who see the logo know that the product has passed rigorous safety tests, and they are more likely to buy it as a result. Stores also value assurances of product safety. They don't want unhappy customers or lawsuits from selling things that turn out to be harmful, so they'll pay extra to stock certified products. Certification firms such as Underwriters Laboratories have no monopoly. They have competitors. Accordingly, they have a strong incentive to be cautious, but also fast and affordable for manufacturers. On the one hand, they depend on their reputations for trustworthiness built up over the years. A certifier who puts its logo on a product that turns out to be dangerous ends up with a damaged reputation and a higher likelihood that manufacturers will use a competing certifier in the future. On the other hand, if a certifier is overcautious and takes a long time on costly extra testing that delays a product from getting to market, or if it refuses to certify a product that turns out to be safe, again it will lose customers. Self-interest pushes these competing certifiers to avoid both kinds of mistakes, neither certifying dangerous products nor refusing to certify safe ones. Compare this to a government agency that has a monopoly on deciding whether a good becomes available. Its incentives are very different. What happens when such an agency approves a dangerous product that ends up causing harm? There are serious consequences for the careers of the officials who let that happen. As a result, they become excessively cautious. They take so long on costly extra testing that they do delay products from getting to market. When the product is a life-saving medicine, people die who could have been saved. Unlike a voluntary certification firm, a monopoly government agency faces no check on this kind of caution. If the agency rejects a product that's safe or takes years for additional tests, the manufacturer cannot turn to another certifier. No other certifiers are permitted. The government agency doesn't have to worry about losing revenue or going out of business because it's funded by taxation and not by the voluntary payments of its manufacturer customers. How much safety is the right amount? It is always possible to test a product one more time before selling it, but the tests cost time and resources to run, so the more rigorous the safety testing procedures, the more a manufacturer must charge to cover its costs, and the less money it has to invest in new products. Who should decide at what point the cost of more tests becomes too high? Under monopolized government safety regulation, government officials decide. Under voluntary certification in a free market, everyone decides for him or herself, usually with the help of certification agencies and professionals such as doctors and pharmacists who make it their business to learn all they can about the products they advise us to use. Instead of the one-size-fits-all approach in which the government bans all products that fail to meet arbitrarily determined criteria, the market process creates and communicates various assurances of product safety, and each buyer decides for him or herself.
The word Marxist, I think people have no idea what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Like socialism, they don't know what they're talking about.
No, they don't.
Most of these words, most people don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
But Marxist, I find to be the one that people really just have no concept of what they're talking about. So first, can you just define what a Marxist is, and then just tell me a little bit about your journey?
Marx was, now here's where I get my right-wing friends they go nuts. I say Marx was the greatest social scientist in the 19th century without compare. And all my friends at the Hoover Institution go, ah! And then I say, but he got everything wrong. And then my friends on the left go, ah! Which is why I haven't got any friends.
The life of a classical liberal. It ain't easy.
It ain't easy.
Well, you're pissing off people on both sides.
Pissing off people on both sides.
Yeah.
Now, the basic idea of Marxism, of course, is that history has a particular pattern, and that ideas come from that pattern, from that material pattern, that the class struggle is central. The history of all hitherto existing societies, to quote the Communist Manifesto, is the history of class struggle. And if you believe that, and you believe that ideas are just epiphenomenal, that they just come from your class position, which is what Marxists are supposed to think, then you'll be a follower of Marx. And oddly, from about 1890 to about 1980, nice symmetry there, most intellectuals in the West were some kind of Marxist. Even the conservatives were. Even the conservatives believed that material interests were what determined ideas. Whereas my claim, and the claim of a growing number of historians and especially historians, is that no, ideas themselves have an influence, and independent influence. And the idea that all men and women, dear, are created equal is a terrifically powerful idea. So it's that egalitarianism of 18th century liberalism that I'm trying to reinvigorate.
Alana Connor, a cultural scientist at Stanford, tells Vox that telling people they're racist, sexist, and xenophobic is going to get you exactly nowhere. Social psychology tells us persuasion happens one of two ways, centrally and peripherally. The central route to persuasion uses reasoned arguments, getting someone to think deeply about an issue. If they're paying attention and they have something at stake, you just might persuade them. The peripheral route is less ideal. It skips reason and relies on superficial cues to do its job. For example, it might make appeals to popularity or authority. But shaming someone, telling them they're racist, sexist, or bigoted, falls into neither of these categories. It's not providing them with a reasoned argument, and it doesn't appeal to them on an emotional level. In fact, shaming someone is more likely to get them to shut you out and form a negative impression of both you and your views, leaving you worse off than you were before. At best, shaming leaves bad ideas in the shadows where they can't be challenged, and where proponents of those bad ideas can't be persuaded. Good ideas become tenuous. If you hold an idea only out of shame, then you likely never went through the process of understanding why it's a good idea, leaving you less able to defend it. Fortunately, there are persuasive ways to reduce prejudiced attitudes. Simply interacting with others, getting people to reflect on why they hold certain views, and asking them to take on new perspectives all appear to be effective ways of undoing prejudices. But when shame is the method, none of that can happen. And this shouldn't be surprising. Calling someone a bigot is little more than an insult. It may feel gratifying, and it may even be true, but if we want outcomes, we should bear in mind that persuasion just doesn't happen that way. Shaming may be successful at shutting people up. Changing their minds? That's a different task entirely.
Opportunity costs, the broken window. Here's a paradox. It seems obvious that disasters destroy wealth, and yet cleaning up after a disaster creates jobs, and creating jobs seems to create wealth. So do natural disasters create wealth, or do they destroy wealth? Frederick Bastiat posed a similar question in his essay on the broken window. In that essay, he tells the story of James Goodfellow and his little boy who breaks a window. Obviously, James is annoyed, but then his neighbor tells him, "Look on the bright side. Broken windows create jobs for glassmakers, and glassmakers create jobs for bakers, and bakers create jobs for wine merchants. Broken windows create jobs in our neighborhood, and jobs create wealth." Now, there is one grain of truth here. Repairing broken windows does create jobs for window makers, but there is an unseen cost to doing so. The money that James spends to fix the window could have been spent on a new pair of shoes. That would have instead created a job for a shoemaker, and he too could have created jobs for bakers and wine merchants and all the rest. There is this difference though. After spending money to fix the window, James will have a functional window. But if the window had never been broken in the first place, then James still would have had a functional window, and he would have had a new pair of shoes as well. So the broken window actually made the neighborhood a little poorer. Poorer by the value of a new pair of shoes, or poorer by the value of the broken window, which comes to the same thing. The neighbor's mistake was that he only saw a job created for a window maker, but he didn't see what was given up in order to create that job. He ignored what economists call opportunity costs. Whenever we use a resource for one purpose, like spending money to fix a window, we have to give up the opportunity to use that resource for any other purpose. So in order to know whether the use of a resource has created wealth or not, we have to compare it with the alternative uses we had to forego. If the use we make of the resource is more beneficial than the other ways we might have used it, then we have created wealth. But if we missed the chance to do something else more beneficial with that resource, then we have destroyed wealth. The amount of wealth we have destroyed depends on how much better off we would have been had we done something else. More technically, the opportunity cost of a use of a resource is the value of the next highest valued alternative use of that resource. So although disasters create jobs, those jobs have extremely high opportunity costs. So disasters don't create wealth. They destroy wealth. So why did James's neighbor make that mistake? That's really the bigger issue that Bastiat is raising in this essay. I think Bastiat expects that most people who read his essay will start out making the same mistake the neighbor made. And we don't just ignore the opportunity costs of fixing broken windows. We tend to ignore opportunity costs in all sorts of cases, and even on a society-wide scale. Why is that? Well, go back to the broken window. One effect of the broken window is that a job goes to a window maker, and that effect is something that happens. But the other effect of the broken window is that a job doesn't go to the shoemaker. In other words, the other effect is something that doesn't happen. That means that one effect is there for us to see, but the other effect is never there for us to see. And opportunity costs are always effects of that second type. Opportunity costs are hard to see for the simple reason that they are alternatives that never take place. Opportunity costs are things that never happen. That's why opportunity costs remain hidden in the shadows, just like the shoemaker in Bastiat's story. So I think the really important point that comes out of Bastiat's essay is that it takes special effort to train ourselves into the habit of always looking in the shadows for hidden opportunity costs. And that is the central habit of the economic way of looking at the choices that we make.